Somebody with a 4.42 GPA and a 1590 SAT score got rejected from how many schools? So for those of you who haven't heard, there's this kid named Stanley and he's from the Palo Alto area in the Bay. This kid made lots of news recently because apparently he applied to 18 different colleges in computer science with really high stats and then got rejected from 16 out of 18 of them. And so today we'll be doing a deep dive into how the heck he possibly could have been rejected from these schools. So a couple of notes before we start. I do need to make some disclaimers. Number one, I'm just using information that is publicly available about this situation. I do need to clarify that a lot of what I'm saying is based on my own opinion. It's all alleged, and even though I have a ton of experience in admissions, I can't say for definitive sure whether or not he got rejected for any particular reason. Anything that I say is not attack on Stanley, his family, or his character. So you can see that he's been on a few different media outlets, and it's reported on a situation very generally. We know the schools that he applied to, we know the schools that he got into, and we know a little bit about his GPA, his test scores, and his high school. He reported that he had a 3.97 unweighted GPA, a 4.42 weighted GPA, and a 1590 SAT score. So what I'm assuming is these are the GPAs that he graduated with, not the GPAs that he applied with, because that makes a huge difference. If you look through what I try to do, I took my calculator, I punched in some numbers, and I got some approximate GPAs that he could have gotten depending on the different number of courses that he's taken. It looks like in the second semester of 9th grade, they didn't report any GPAs whatsoever due to the thing that happened that nobody talks about. So it looks like in order to get a 3.97 unweighted GPA, he took anywhere between 20 to 23 courses in high school. The only way he could have gotten a 3.97 GPA is if he got 1B at some point. So then these are my assumptions. Stanley took 22 courses throughout all of high school, possibly one semester with a B at some point in his 10th and 11th grade. So if I start to insert the number of APs and honors classes he could have taken, mathematically it makes sense that he took 9 weighted courses. So if you look into his school profile, it looks like they didn't give any weighted courses for classes taken in 9th grade. So then we can assume that the 9 weighted courses that he got credit for were in 10th, 11th, and 12th. My assumption then is he took 3 weighted classes in 10th, 3 in 11th, and 3 in 12th. So if that's the case, we can deconstruct his 10th and 11th grade GPA, which is what schools like the UC system use. If we take away the 9th grade and 12th grade grades, his UC unweighted GPA would be a 3.96, his weighted capped GPA would be a 4.25, and his weighted uncapped GPA would be a 4.39. Here's a little bit more context of his high school. So I've included all the students who qualified for National Merit Scholar. So these are students who've gotten the top of the top in terms of their PSAT score. And you can see that in his graduating class of 2023, there were 31 kids who qualified for National Merit Scholar, which means that there are at least 31 kids who had similar SAT scores as he did. So for more context, here's a graph of grade inflation and how it's increased over the past 55 years or so. And then I've also managed to gather this data from the UC system itself showing the applied GPAs, the admitted GPAs, and the enrolled GPAs for Stanley's specific high school. You can see that in 1994, the GPAs were around the mid to upper 3s. If we scroll down to the 2005 era, we're now in the upper 3s. We scroll down to the 2015 times, and now things are peaking into the 4s. And the latest data we have available is from 2020, where you can see the GPAs of almost all the admitted students averaged around 4.3. That means on average, the students all had straight A's. Here's some more data that I was able to gather from his high school. So for the class of 2023, you can see that there is 484 students, and that there were over half of those students had an unweighted GPA of 3.76 and above. So we know that he was somehow in that group of 250 or so students. So notice how it says 6 semesters here. That means they took the GPAs from 9th grade, 10th grade, and 11th grade. And remember, they didn't weight any grades for 9th grade. So this weighted GPA thing that I said of 4.39, that was 10th and 11th. So we can assume that Stanley's GPA was below that 4.39. So we can see that even though he got just one B, he was close to that 10% marker, if not below, for his high school. So here's some more context. You can see that last year, I think this was 2022 actually, in 2022, about 300 people applied and then 27 people got admitted. So if we're saying that he's close to the 10% marker in his class, he's probably ranked around maybe 40 or so. So he definitely wouldn't have been admitted to UCLA regardless of major. And then you could see for Berkeley, right? Berkeley, they admitted 40 kids almost. So then technically he would have been on that borderline if we're just purely looking at grades. So the UCs use something called a rigor score, and Stanley has a rigor score of 18, which is basically his 9 classes that he took times 2. Let's look at Berkeley, right? You can see that their middle 50%, which is a weighted uncapped GPA, is 4.28 to 4.62. So he'd fall towards the lower half of that. So that means he's probably below average for Berkeley. You could see for Davis, right? Davis uses a capped GPA, so you can see that he's slightly above the 75th percentile, so that's good for Davis. And then the school that everybody cares about, here's UCLA's stats. You can see that their middle 50%, they use the uncapped GPA. His 4.39 would have put him below the 25th percentile. And you can see that his rigor score of 18 falls below the average 25 that UCLA had. For more context, he was applying for computer science, which was the most impacted major in the entire UC system. I've gone through all the conferences, I've met with UC reps, and they basically say that if your kid's applying for computer science at any school, please consider an alternate major because they just don't have the space. Then we look at a school like University of Washington at Seattle. So you see here that if you're Washington residents, they accept a quarter of the kids, but if you're from out of state, they only accept 2% of kids into the major. So if you're looking at the numbers, his GPA doesn't even put him into the top 10% or barely puts him in the top 10% of the class. And then he's applying for programs that have single-digit admit rates. There's something that doesn't quite align right there. So we also need to consider the different UC campuses. The computer science program is limited by space. So at a school like UC Santa Barbara, which is really popular, their computer science program only seats 150 kids per year. So that brings the acceptance rate down into the single tiny digits too. So then the question comes up, well, what about his 1590? What about his 1590? Well, there's a bunch of schools that are either test-free or barely consider tests. The UCs don't consider test scores no matter how well you did. The Cal States don't. And for University of Washington, they rarely consider test scores unless you're a borderline candidate. So then what about the other schools then? They must consider the test scores? Absolutely, they do consider test scores, but they consider a bunch of other things too. So here's a presentation by the National Association of College Admissions Counseling, and you can see all the variety of factors here that they do consider considerably important in the admissions process. Now, I don't know which school falls under which category, but you can see that a lot of schools put moderate or considerable importance on the counselor recommendation, the teacher recommendation, the extracurricular activities, the essay or writing sample. And those are things about Stanley that we know absolutely nothing about. He could have smashed them or he could have smashed them. And so you can see here that there's a variety of other factors that colleges are paying attention to: state or country of residence, gender, high school attended, first generation status. And for a kid who goes to an affluent school in a very white collar area, these are things that are not working towards his advantage. So there are some other factors that I think played into his decision. This was a survey that was done by Brown University on how the kids manage the application process. And you can see that depending on parental education, it impacted how students applied to college. Among students whose parents had a master's or PhD or above, you can see that at least for a school like Brown, the majority of them applied early decision. Based off of what I can tell from the limited information about Stanley, I don't think he applied early decision anywhere. And then you can look at the AP enrollment trend from a school like Brown. You can see that it makes a nice little bell curve for public school, which is where he went. And the middle of the bell curve is 9 through 10. And based off of all the information that I can gather about this kid is he was either at the middle or below the middle. And for a student like Stanley who goes to a school like Stanley does, you need to be at the upper end of the bell curve. So we do need to talk about the schools that he did get into, right? So he got into UT Austin, which is great. It's a really selective school. It accepts very few kids from out of state. And I think one of the reasons he was able to get in is because of his great test score and because that school cares about major preparedness. They care about the resume, and it's pretty clear that he has a strong resume, at least from what the news says. And then we see that he got in a school like University of Maryland. The interesting thing about this school is that they don't strongly consider major in the process. Students essentially all apply and they get in, they're undecided, and then they apply for their major once they're there. So the one head scratcher that I do have is University of Wisconsin. I don't know why he didn't get in, because they don't strongly consider major in the process either. So I'm wondering what about his application must have been missing or must have been not up to par. In this situation, context plays a huge key. So here are the pieces of context that I think played a factor in his application process. Number one, his father was employed by Google. When your father works for a multi-billion-dollar tech company, I think that there are certain expectations that are placed on the student. I'm not saying it's fair, I'm not saying it's unfair, I'm saying that there are certain expectations that are placed on a kid like him. He has a startup listed on his application. We do know that piece of information. So that is kind of expected from a student who comes from the Silicon Valley. A couple pieces that we don't know that I think may have impacted him is we don't know about his essays, we don't know about his letters of recommendation, we don't know about his resume. And then the other thing that I think played a huge factor in his decision was that he seemingly or allegedly did not apply early decision anywhere. I don't want this to all be doom and gloom for you, right? I do want you to have some takeaways. So what takeaways do I have for you? I want you to apply to college broadly, especially if you're thinking about a highly selective major like computer science. You can see that he applied to really popular schools that everybody's heard of, but there are so many other schools that might be a good fit for you, especially if you're considering an impacted major. I think we can consider that job outcomes in this situation aren't as strongly linked to the college that you go to as much as people like to think of it that way. You see that he got a job at Google even though he didn't attend any one of the colleges that are next to Google. In fact, we can assume that he might have gotten a job at Google because his dad works there. Where you go to high school and your familial context matters a lot, and there's nothing you can do about it. I have students coming to me saying, well,
can I pretend to be a certain race?
Please don't do that.
Or can I lie about something in my application?
Please don't do that. I want you to accept that who you are is who you are, embrace your authenticity, and use that to your advantage in the admissions process. So if you come from a highly populated area, the sad reality is that they might not want 1 million kids from your high school, and that's fine. That just means you need to look broadly and find out where you fit into college. And then the other thing is your high school context matters too. I know that a lot of colleges have removed things like ranking and test scores and all that sort of stuff. So then from your end, it behooves you to understand where you fall into the context of your high school. So the data is available out there, but I don't want students just to assume that just because they have a blah, blah, blah GPA and a blah, blah, blah test score, that they fall within a certain category of their school, because the colleges do have their way of disaggregating the data to figure out what your alleged ranking is. So please keep that context in mind as you're applying to college. So this is all to not freak you out, but to give you the context of what happened in this situation.